I woke on my 75th birthday with a peculiar quiet pressing against the walls of my bedroom. There wasn't a breeze, no laughter in the kitchen, no scent of coffee, or the comforting waft of something sweet baking in the oven. For 75 years, birthdays had always been colored by noise and chaos, children's feet slapping the floor, someone burning toast, the off-key harmony of Happy Birthday sung too early in the morning. This time there was stillness. My bed, which once felt like a sanctuary, suddenly felt too big, the sheets too smooth, too cold. I lay there for a while, blinking at the ceiling and listening to the silence like it might speak. I suppose I had expected more. Not extravagance, no, but something heartfelt. A familiar voice humming an old tune, a favorite mug laid out with care, a thoughtful glance that said, "I remember." Instead, I rose slowly, letting my bones speak for themselves, and shuffled into slippers. My hallway used to echo with framed photographs and crayon drawings, taped up with pride, but most of them had been taken down a few months ago at my son's suggestion. "We'll get it all streamlined for the party," he'd said, with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. I hadn't protested. I should have. When I reached the kitchen, it looked like something out of a home magazine, clean, curated, and personal. Beige linens, cream plates, soft jazz playing from a wireless speaker perched precisely on the counter. There were no balloons, no silly cards, no mismatched chairs. It was all too coordinated, too perfect, and terribly hollow. My son stood at the stove dressed in a too-tight shirt with rolled-up sleeves, like he'd seen on a cooking show. "Happy birthday, Ma," he said, without turning his tone light but hurried as if checking off a box. I smiled, or tried to. "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied, walking further into the room, waiting for a hug that never came. His fiancée arrived a few moments later, air-kissing both my cheeks and setting down a beige gift bag, as if it might bruise the marble countertop. "Hope you're ready for the big day," she chirped. I wasn't sure if she meant the party or their wedding. Maybe both. She floated around the kitchen, giving direction without asking, rearranging napkins I hadn't touched, commenting on the lighting, asking if I had a more neutral pitcher for the lemonade. I watched them side by side, choreographing the morning like hosts of a lifestyle show. They didn't notice that I hadn't said much. They didn't ask about my dreams last night, or the old woman in the mirror that startled me when I got out of the shower. They didn't ask how it felt to turn 75. They didn't ask if I felt loved. And maybe that's what made it worse. Not the quiet, not the beige, not the jazz, or the lack of photos. It was the fact that I had begun to feel like a guest in a life I spent decades building, as if I'd handed over the keys and they'd repainted the walls without asking. I sat at the polished table and looked out the window where the old garden bench my husband built was half covered by a new modern planter box. Everything I loved had been softened, blurred, erased. Later that morning, I wandered to the hall closet, pretending to look for my shawl. But really, I just needed to see if the box of old birthday cards was still there. The ones with scribbled "I," "Love you," grandma messages, and glitter that never quite dried. I found them tucked behind some throw pillows. I opened one. Inside was a childish drawing of me with a cake and candles that reached the top of the page. My name was spelled wrong, but the heart behind it, unmistakable. I clutched that little card to my chest and let the tears come, quietly, slowly, like rain on a rooftop, steady and uninvited. They thought this day was about their taste, their version of elegance, but all I wanted was to feel remembered, not repackaged. That morning, the silence didn't come from the absence of sound. It came from the absence of recognition. I had woken up on my 75th birthday to a celebration that forgot who I was. And somewhere inside that stillness, something began to stir. Not anger. No, not yet. but something close, a whisper of a thought. Maybe I wasn't the one who needed to change. I stayed in that hallway longer than I should have, my fingers brushing the edges of the old birthday card like it was a relic. In many ways, it was. It came from a time when joy wasn't so choreographed, when mess was welcome, when the icing on a cake didn't need to match the plates. I slid the card back into its envelope and tucked it into my sweater pocket. Something about having it close helped me breathe through the ache in my chest. Back in the kitchen, the party had begun to unfurl itself, but it didn't feel like mine. The dining room had been reconfigured into what they called a grazing space. Long platters of cut cheeses, dehydrated fruits, and tiny crackers fanned out like they belonged in a lifestyle magazine. There wasn't a deviled egg in sight, no warm casserole, no punch bowl, no smell of cinnamon or rosemary, just scents that came out of bottles and candles labeled with names like linen breeze and sun-washed driftwood. It all looked so sterile. My son walked past me carrying a tray of lemon water with floating sprigs of thyme, nodding with approval at the decor his fiancée had chosen. "Looks great, right?" he asked. "So modern. Just the vibe we wanted." I offered a polite smile even as my heart folded in on itself. The vibe we wanted, not a word about what I might have loved, not a thought about what had brought comfort and tradition to this home for generations. I tried to find a place to stand where I wouldn't feel in the way, but everywhere I turned, something had changed. The living room, once filled with crocheted blankets and overstuffed cushions, was now stripped down, streamlined. My rocker had been moved into the garage to make space, and the old brass lamp my husband gave me one Christmas was nowhere to be seen. In its place, a sleek black floor light that glared like an interrogation bulb. People began to arrive. Most of them were from my son's world, co-workers, neighbors, from their condo, friends I didn't know well. They greeted me with flat smiles, careful hugs, compliments that felt practiced. One woman actually said, "You don't look a day over 68," as though that was meant to make me feel seen. Another guest asked me where the bathroom was, and then without waiting for the answer, turned to the fiancé to confirm. And through all of this, I kept looking for someone that felt familiar. But even the music had been carefully selected to avoid anything too sentimental, as she had put it weeks earlier. No Etta James, no Nat King Cole, just ambient noise, barely melodic, like it was afraid of being remembered. At one point, I excused myself and went to the hallway mirror. I needed to see myself, to remember who I was, beneath the foundation they'd laid over everything. I stared into my own eyes, the same ones that had watched over scraped knees, stayed open through late-night fevers, narrowed in worry, widened in joy. Eyes that had seen more loss and love than anyone in that house could imagine. And then I heard it. A guest, one of her friends, laughing softly as she pointed to a wall where my embroidered family tree used to hang. What was that weird thing she had here before? Looked like something from a craft fair. She giggled. The fiancé answered, "Oh, that. Yeah, I made him take it down. Didn't match the clean lines. Didn't match my life, my labor, my story, my roots, all scrubbed away because they didn't match, as if I had become an inconvenience to their brand, a blemish in their sleek little world." I returned to the party and tried to engage. I poured myself a glass of water. I thanked people for coming. I nodded through conversations, but inside I was peeling away layer by layer. My voice became softer, my smile thinner. I found myself standing at the edges of the room like a misplaced piece of furniture waiting to be hauled out. Eventually, my son came over with a fresh cocktail in hand, his voice a little too loud and cheerful. "You having a good time, Ma?" he asked. "Isn't it perfect?" I looked at him, then really looked. The boy I raised was still in there somewhere, but he had become muted, curated, cleaned up into someone else's vision. I didn't answer him right away. I just reached into my sweater and pressed the birthday card in my pocket between my fingers. "Do you remember when you were 7, I asked, and you made me that clay turtle for my birthday? It had one eye and no tail." He blinked, thrown off. Yeah, maybe I think I remember." "You were so proud," I said. "You cried when the glaze cracked, said you'd ruined it. But I kept it. It sat on the windowsill for 30 years. He laughed softly. "Yeah, that old thing." It meant something, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, because it was real. He smiled, distracted already, half looking toward someone calling his name across the room. "Well, we've come a long way since turtles," he said, and patted my shoulder, like I was made of glass. Yes, we had. Too far, maybe. That evening, as I sat quietly in my room, untouched dessert plate on my lap, I realized the party had been a performance. Not for me, for them, for the image they wanted to project. And I was just another prop, a piece of outdated furniture that had been reluctantly left in the corner. But something was beginning to rise in me, a quiet clarity, not yet a decision, but a seed. One I would water soon. I thought foolishly, perhaps, that things would shift once everyone had a drink in hand, once the laughter softened and the layers peeled away. But the opposite happened. As the afternoon wore on, I felt myself vanishing. Every conversation danced around me, not through me. I would enter a room and watch their eyes glance past, searching for someone more relevant, someone with better lighting. Even my own son, whom I had raised on casseroles and bedtime stories, and nights spent worrying about how to pay for his braces, had become a stranger in this designer version of my home. It wasn't always this way. There was a time he clung to my hip like a vine to a trellis, a time when he'd pull at my hand and whisper his fears into my sleeve, when his tiny drawings would appear taped to the fridge with a proud, "It's you, Mama, that little boy, who used to help me knead bread, who cried when he first saw me cry," was gone. I kept waiting for him to come back, even just for a moment, to look at me with those eyes full of boyish knowing, to notice that I had shrunk somehow, not in size, but in place. I tried once more to inject myself into their world, foolish again, when I walked toward the speakers and requested one small favor, a song, something soft and old, maybe Sam Cooke or Roberta Flack. My son's fiancée tilted her head, smiling in that tight way women do when they're correcting a child in public. "We're kind of keeping things upbeat for the vibe," she said, using that word again. Vibe. A word that had started to taste like chalk. I backed away. I didn't argue. What would have been the point? I'd learned long ago that dignity is often found in silence. But as I sat in the far corner of the living room, the corner where my husband used to sit reading the paper, where the chair had been replaced by a faceless cream ottoman, I felt the betrayal bloom fully in my chest. They had taken my stories and painted over them. Not maliciously, no. That would have been easier to fight. No, this was worse. This was erasure dressed up as good taste, love disguised as efficiency, modernity sold as evolution, with my history the cost of admission. At one point, a woman I barely knew struck up a conversation with me about my plans for aging, as if I were a project, a portfolio to manage. She asked if I'd looked into senior communities, casually noting that the sooner you get settled, the more control you have. I smiled at her, sharp and sweet. "I'm not a suitcase," I said. "I don't need to be settled." She laughed nervously and excused herself. I didn't blame her. The truth is abrasive when it's dressed plainly. Later, as the party reached its crescendo, my son raised a glass to give a speech. The room quieted, and for the first time that day, all eyes turned to me. I braced myself. Maybe, just maybe, he'd say something real, something not written by his fiancée or run through a filter. "To the woman who made me who I am," he began. "We wanted to throw her a birthday that matched her elegance, her simplicity, her timelessness." Elegance, simplicity, timelessness, no mention of grit, of survival, of the nights I stayed up sewing back patches into his jeans, of the smell of hospital corridors when his fever wouldn't break, of the years I spent shrinking myself to give him space to grow. "She's always been a classic," he said, raising his glass. "Here's to 75 more." They clapped. She kissed my cheek, and I smiled because that's what mothers do. We smile through funerals of selves we can no longer afford to be. I clinked my glass, but I didn't drink. I stared at the bubbles in the champagne like they held the pieces of me they'd forgotten. After the toast, the fiancé gathered some friends near the fireplace and began talking about the wedding. It had become her favorite subject, her identity, really. The wedding was no longer an event, it was a production. A curated fantasy of minimalist beauty and sophisticated neutrality which I had come to understand meant nothing, old, nothing, loud, nothing inconvenient. I overheard her say, "We're thinking no kids, no clutter, just clean lines, and definitely none of that sentimental stuff, no weird readings or vintage lace." Then she laughed. "We're keeping it basic but elevated, you know." That word again. Basic. It clanged in my mind like a church bell with no hour to strike. I turned my head slowly. My ears rang. For a moment the room faded behind a thick wall of fog. No vintage lace. She meant my wedding dress, the one I had offered her hesitantly, tearfully thinking maybe she'd feel honored. She had smiled at the time, but I saw now that her smile had been a shield, a polite refusal in slow motion. She hadn't even taken it home. Later that evening I found it, still tucked in the back of the guest room closet, preserved in the same satin box I'd carried for over 50 years. It smelled like lavender and thyme. I sat with it in my lap, tracing the delicate embroidery with the pads of my fingers. Each stitch told a story. My mother had sewn it with aching hands and eyes that refused to quit. She had made it from a pair of curtains and a tablecloth because we couldn't afford silk. But it had been enough. I had been enough. But not for them, not anymore. And suddenly the fog inside me cleared. Something shifted, not loud or explosive, but permanent. I felt the weight of the lace in my hands, and I knew what I needed to do. The wedding talk became louder over the following days. Every phone call from my son was a logistical list. Colors, dates, caterers. His voice was always hurried, excited, distracted. And God knows I tried to stay connected, to offer opinions, to feel included. But everything I said was met with a soft dismissal. We're going in a different direction. That's not really the feel we're going for. It's a bit too traditional. Traditional, like it was a bad word. The final straw didn't arrive with fanfare. It came in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon, delivered in the form of an email. Not even a call. An email. Subject line, family wedding notes. The body read like a company memo attire guidelines, speech time slots, a reminder to avoid emotional oversharing, and a list of people we'd like to keep camera time limited for. Camera time. My name had a note next to it, heat background, no direct mic time unless brief. I stared at the screen, my breath shallow. I read it again. No direct mic time. So that was it. I had become a background object in my own child's life. A piece of scenery meant to complete the picture, but never speak within it. I didn't respond. I didn't call. I simply sat there in the quiet house that still smelled faintly of birthday candles that no one had bothered to light. Outside, the wind lifted the edge of the garden tarp, revealing the patch of soil I used to till every spring. I remembered planting tulips with my son when he was 6. He had shoved the bulbs into the earth like they were treasure, and I let him, knowing they'd bloom regardless. That night, I opened the closet again and pulled out the box that held my dress, not to offer it, not to plead, but to reclaim it. I laid it across the bed and looked at it the way you look at someone you've loved your whole life but forgot to see. It wasn't perfect. The seams had loosened with age and one sleeve bore a faint tea stain from a celebration long past, but it held more story in its threadbare lace than anything they were building for that wedding. The next morning I drove to the venue. I'd been silent when they booked it. I'd said nothing when they bragged about the deposit, but the name was still in my own. It had been gifted to them technically, as part of a shared account my husband and I once opened for milestones. I walked in with the papers folded in my purse. The receptionist smiled too brightly. I handed her my ID. "I'd like to cancel the booking," I said calmly. Her eyes widened. "Is everything all right?" "No," I said, "but it will be." She hesitated. "We can return half the deposit." "I'm not asking for a refund." She blinked, confused. "You don't want the money back?" I shook my head slowly. "No. Consider it a small price for clarity." The paperwork was quick, cold, transactional. I signed the forms with steady hands and returned to the car. There was no dramatic music, no swelling triumph, just the slow exhale of a woman who had remembered herself. I drove home the long way through streets I hadn't wandered in years, past the old grocery where I once chased my son through the cereal aisle, past the park where he learned to ride a bike. The world had changed around me, but the memories lived stitched into the cracks of every sidewalk. When I got home, I made tea, real tea. Not the bagged kind with branding and slogans, but the loose leaves I kept in a tin passed down from my mother. I sat in the living room, the corner they didn't want in the wedding photos, and I wrote a note. Not to hurt, not to shame, but to explain. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the kitchen counter. Next to it, I laid the lace. Not the whole dress, just a piece I had trimmed quietly the night before. A symbol, a sliver, a whisper of what they had refused to hear. And beside that, I left the checkbook, open, void written in cursive across the wedding line. I didn't need a confrontation. I didn't want a scene. I didn't even care if they understood right away. But they would feel it. They would feel the shift in the air, the quiet, deliberate refusal of a woman who had spent her life making room for others, finally making room for herself. Later that evening, my phone rang. I didn't answer. It rang again and again. I watched it light up from across the room as I sat in the glow of my reading lamp, the one they had tried to store away. I turned the page in my book. The phone rang once more and then fell silent. I smiled to myself, not with triumph, but with the aching peace of someone who had finally drawn a line. Not out of anger, out of necessity. It wasn't just about a wedding. It wasn't just about beige linens or speeches or camera time. It was about being made small, about being erased while still breathing. So I canceled the venue, not to punish, but to remind them I exist. I remember. I matter. It was 2 days before they came by the house. I knew they would. The silence between us had never lasted long, at least not until recently. Once upon a time, my son would have been at my door with flowers and apologies before the sun had set. But now his silence had matured into something colder, something strategic, like he was waiting for me to explain myself. When the knock finally came, I was sitting by the window with a cup of ginger tea and a blanket across my lap. I didn't rise right away. I let the knock echo once more, then once again. Only then did I push myself to standing and move toward the door slowly, deliberately, like a woman who owed no urgency to the world outside her walls. It was him, alone. She wasn't with him. His mouth was tight and his eyes scanned me like he wasn't quite sure what version of me he'd find. I held the door open and stepped aside. No words, just room. He walked in like a stranger visiting a museum he once loved. The house felt different. I had brought back some of my older things from the garage: the quilted throw, the brass lamp, a photo of my husband and I in our wedding clothes proudly tacked to the wall. The rooms breathed again. Not perfectly styled, not Instagram ready, but real. He noticed. I watched his eyes pause on the old rocker, on the pile of crocheted cushions, on the faint smell of cardamom and lemon oil I had rubbed into the corners. "You changed it back," he said quietly. I nodded. I brought myself home again. He looked down at his hands. "You canceled the wedding venue." I did. He inhaled like he was about to make a speech, then stopped. He ran a hand through his hair. "You didn't talk to me first." I let the silence rest between us. "Neither did you." His brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "When you planned my birthday without asking what I wanted. When you handed my life over to someone who thinks quilts are clutter. When you turned me into a backdrop. Did you talk to me then?" His lips parted, but nothing came out. I waited, not impatiently, not angrily, just long enough for the truth to float in and settle. "I didn't mean to make you feel like that," he said. "We just wanted everything to look beautiful." I tilted my head. "You wanted it to look beautiful, but not to feel like home." He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, the one she said was too bulky. His eyes roamed the room again, softer this time. "She didn't mean harm. She has a vision." And I had a life, I said, a story, a house full of memory. I offered them to you both. She said they were too basic. His face darkened with embarrassment, with guilt. He looked away. "She says things sometimes, without thinking." "No," I said gently. "She says exactly what she means. She just didn't expect me to listen." We sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that stretches between a mother and son, when everything familiar has been wrapped in new packaging, when the language you once spoke fluently together now feels foreign. Eventually he looked at me again. "Why now?" he asked. "Why pull back from the wedding?" I reached into the side table drawer and took out the piece of lace. I laid it gently on the table between us. The light caught the threads. My mother's stitches shimmered like they were breathing again. "I offered her this," I said. "She left it in the closet." His eyes welled up. "Just a little, not enough to fall. I didn't know." "You didn't ask." I leaned forward, then my voice soft but anchored. "I've spent my life giving, quietly, constantly. But giving does not mean erasing. I won't hand over my history to people who think it's clutter." He nodded, swallowing hard. "So what happens now?" I folded my hands. "That's up to you. I won't stand in your way. If you want to get married, but I won't fund a day where I am expected to be quiet, where I'm told what not to wear, how not to speak, where I'm asked to disappear into soft lighting and muted tones, like a photograph framed for aesthetics, not meaning." He nodded slowly. "You won't come." I didn't say that. I said I won't disappear. He exhaled, long and low, and then for the first time in years, he leaned forward and took my hand, just like he did when he was small and afraid and unsure. "Can I ask you something?" he whispered. "What would your wedding have looked like if it were today?" I smiled, a deep, sad, joyful smile, not perfect, but full, loud with laughter, hands sticky with frosting, music that meant something, and lace that didn't match anything except the heartbeat behind it. He nodded again. His thumb moved across my hand slowly. I think I forgot how much of you I come from. You didn't forget, I said. You just stopped looking. The moment passed, but something had returned to the room. Something quiet and real. No resolution, no guarantee, but presence. And that sometimes is the beginning of truth. He left not long after. We didn't hug. We didn't promise anything. We just stood at the door looking at each other, like two people seeing the outline of something familiar after a long, heavy fog. He said, I'll talk to her. I nodded. Then he added softer, thank you for being honest. And then he walked down the steps into his car and drove away. I stood there until the taillights vanished around the corner, the air still warm from his presence, though my hand felt strangely colder without his wrapped around it. That night I didn't cry. I thought I might, but there were no tears left, just a quiet fullness inside me, like I had reclaimed a part of myself I didn't realize had been rented out. I sat at the kitchen table long after the sun went down. I didn't turn on any lights. I just let the dim blue of dusk settle into the corners the way my husband used to, when he couldn't sleep, staring out the window, holding his coffee like it held all the answers. I wondered what he would have thought of this moment. I wondered what advice he would have whispered if he were still here. Let them miss you, he used to say when people took too much without saying thank you. Sometimes love needs space to echo. The next morning I received a message, not from my son, from her. A text short and clipped, I heard what you did. I guess we'll find another venue. Disappointed, that was all. No greeting, no name, no question. Just blame polished in passive aggression. I stared at the screen, and for the first time I didn't feel small under her tone. I didn't feel the urge to justify myself or smooth things over. I set the phone down and went to water the garden. It had been months since I tended to it. She had once called it chaotic, said the wildflowers looked unintentional. But it had grown anyway, despite the drought, the pruning, the neglect. Something in that soil remembered how to bloom. The lavender was tall, the mint had escaped the planter box, and the sunflowers I hadn't planted had grown up in the cracks like they had chosen me instead. I crouched low and let my hands sink into the earth. I didn't wear gloves. I wanted the dirt under my nails. I wanted to feel something alive again, something that didn't ask to be shaped or polished, or made to match a table setting. Later, as I sat on the porch with muddy knees and a heart strangely soothed, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. From her. A dress, cream, expensive, hanging in some boutique window. No note, just the image. As if to say, this is the look. The implication was clear. The message was sharp. This is the wedding. Fit in or fade out. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Instead, I went upstairs to the cedar chest and pulled out a photograph of my mother. She was young, strong-jawed, standing beside the same wedding dress I had once offered them. Behind her was the farmhouse we lost after my father died, and in her arms the hem of the dress was clutched like a promise to herself. I remembered her saying, we didn't have much, but we had what mattered, and we wore it proudly. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. Then quietly I undid the top button of my blouse and held the lace scrap from my dress up to my shoulder. Not to wear, just to see. Just to remember the shape of who I had been, who I still was under the layers they had tried to smooth away. She sent another message that night. We're sending new invites. Ceremony is private. Reception only for close circle. We'll let you know if plans change. She didn't need to say it outright. I could hear it between the lines. "You're not welcome anymore." I didn't respond. The next morning I baked a peach cobbler, the kind my son used to love when he was a boy, and swore no one made like I did. I didn't make it for anyone else, just for me. The smell filled the kitchen the way memories do, uninvited, overwhelming, and achingly warm. I cut a piece still steaming and sat at the table alone. The first bite tasted like memory, the second like power. I started going through my finances that afternoon, not out of spite, but out of clarity. There were funds I'd left untouched for years, accounts I'd built with the idea of passing something down. But what good is passing down something to people who don't want to carry you with it? I called my lawyer. "I want to revise the documents I said." "To remove someone?" "To remember myself," I answered. He was quiet a moment, understood. We scheduled the appointment. And that night, for the first time in years, I slept through without waking. No dreams, no anxiety, just stillness. Because I hadn't lost a son. I had simply removed myself from a table where I was being served as decor. And in that quiet, I was beginning to hear my own voice again. Not the edited one, the real one, the one that sang lullabies and shouted across football fields, the one that wept into pillows and read fairy tales aloud. The voice that said, "This is not what I raised you for." The day of the new wedding announcements came quietly, no calls, no invitations, just a glossy white envelope slid into my mailbox like an advertisement. Inside was a card with raised lettering, all minimal elegance and sterile grace, just like the birthday, just like everything had become. It read, "Please join us in celebrating the union of..." and then their names interlocked in some custom font that looked like it had never known hardship. At the bottom, in faint gray script, was a final note. "Private ceremony. Reception to follow. Limited seating." No dear mother, no warmth, no space. They had uninvited me with such professionalism it almost felt like customer service. I placed the card on the kitchen counter right beside my will. It looked absurd next to the thick folder of documents my lawyer had helped me prepare. One held the memory of promises. The other held the truth of consequences. I didn't tear it up. I didn't burn it. I let it sit there like a symbol, like an unopened door that no longer led to anywhere I needed to be. 2 days later, the phone rang again. This time it was my niece. One of the few still grounded in the memory of who I really was, before the magazines, before the granite countertops and invisible chairs. She asked if I was attending the wedding, her voice laced with hesitation, like she already knew. "I wasn't invited," I said plainly. There was a long pause. "That's not right," she whispered. "That's not who he used to be." "No," I said, "but it is who he's become." She offered to skip the event. I told her not to. I didn't need a protest. I needed peace. And I was beginning to understand that the deepest peace comes not from fighting to stay at someone else's table, but from building your own again, quietly, with chairs that creak and cushions that don't match. That week, I started rearranging my house, not for them, for me. I brought down the photo albums. I put the embroidered family tree back on the wall, even though the frame had warped slightly. I replaced the fake eucalyptus with fresh lilacs from the neighbor's garden. I dragged the rocker back into its rightful place, even though it scuffed the floor. And I cooked real food, comfort food, loud, messy, unapologetic food. On the day of the wedding, I wore blue, not black like mourning, not beige like erasure, but blue, the same shade I wore when I brought him home from the hospital all those years ago, wrapped in a blanket with frayed corners and love stitched into every fiber. The wedding unfolded without me. I saw photos later, someone posted them online. A perfectly curated day, everyone in matching suits and pastel dresses. The ceremony was held in a sterile modern glass chapel with no pews, just pale folding chairs that looked too fragile to hold real grief. I studied each photo like a detective looking for a clue. I saw smiles. I saw symmetry. But I didn't see joy. Not the kind I remembered. There were no belly laughs. No grandparents in the front row holding back tears. No kids dancing wildly on the edge of the reception. Just structure. Just the vibe. And then I saw at one photo of her walking down the aisle arm in arm with her father, and I noticed the hem of her dress. Clean, sharp, machine-made, no lace, no story, no ghosts of the women who came before, just silk, pressed smooth and lifeless. I closed the screen. That night I lit a candle for myself. I sat on the porch with a shawl over my shoulders and let the dusk rise around me. A breeze rustled the chimes. Somewhere down the street a child was laughing wild and untrained. I smiled, feeling the ache of it. Not because I wanted back in, but because I knew I had chosen something more sacred than attendance. I had chosen remembrance. My son didn't call the next day, nor the next. I suppose he needed time to shape a version of events where I was the villain, the woman who ruined everything with her stubbornness, the mother who just couldn't let go. But what they'll never understand is I didn't cling. I released. I let go of a version of myself they had rewritten without asking, and in doing so I returned to the woman I used to be before their edits. In the following weeks, I hosted my own gathering. Small, no theme, just people who remembered my name without squinting. We drank sweet tea and played old records. One neighbor brought lemon squares. Another sang softly under her breath when my favorite song came on. A toddler climbed into my lap and spilled juice on my blouse, and I laughed so hard it startled the birds outside. There were no photos posted, no hashtags, no filtered captions about aesthetic bliss, just warmth, laughter, connection. Someone asked me if I felt sad about missing the wedding. I sipped my tea. No, I said gently. I missed nothing. I was never meant to be in that story. I only thought I was. The days after my son's wedding passed like wind through old trees, quiet, steady, and strangely hollow. I kept waiting for the sting for the breakdown. I imagined I might wake in the night clawing at regrets, wondering if I'd gone too far, wondering if the cost of self-respect was too high. But that night never came. The silence didn't hurt the way I expected. It felt clean, like the air after a storm. I suppose part of me had always lived in fear of being cut off, of being discarded, of becoming one of those women you see in the grocery store clutching a can of soup and a handful of coupons telling the cashier stories no one listens to. But fear makes us small, and small was something I'd been wearing like an old apron for years. That apron was off now, folded, put away. There was one thing, though, that lingered. My son's eyes. In that brief visit before the wedding, when he sat across from me and held my hand, I'd seen something flicker, a boy looking through a man's face. And I wondered quietly, gently, not urgently, if he had seen me too. If maybe some small part of him was beginning to realize what had been lost, not just with the wedding, but with the slow, quiet death of our history. I didn't wish him harm. I never could. Mothers aren't built that way, no matter how deeply we're hurt. But I stopped praying for his return. I started praying for his remembrance. And in the meantime, I lived. That's the thing no one tells you about late life clarity. It doesn't arrive like a lightning bolt. It seeps in, through cracks in old habits, through silence that stretches long enough to hear your own breath again. I started spending more time with the women at the local community garden. We laughed about things that didn't need to be pretty. We pulled weeds with our hands and let the dirt settle into our cuticles. One of them, a woman named Denise, invited me to a Sunday book circle. I hadn't read for leisure in years. But that afternoon we all curled into mismatched chairs and shared words over lemon cake, and I remembered what it felt like to belong without having to be silent. I told them eventually about the birthday, about the venue, about the lace. Not all at once, just little pieces like seeds dropped along a path, and every time I spoke a sliver of it aloud, the wound lost some of its edge. They didn't gasp. They didn't rush to fix it. They just nodded, their faces lined with the kind of understanding that only comes from having lived through their own versions of forgetting. One woman reached over, touched my arm, and said, "You didn't cancel a wedding, sweetheart. You reclaimed a boundary." Those words stuck. I wrote them down later in a small notebook I had pulled from the back of my dresser. It used to hold shopping lists. Now it held fragments of myself. You didn't cancel a wedding. You reclaimed a boundary. The next week I opened the old trunk again, not for the dress this time, but for the letters. Decades of them. Birthday cards, notes from my husband, hand-drawn pictures from when my son was still small and wild and full of love. I reread each one. I cried softly at the ones he wrote with backwards letters and uneven lines, and I wept harder at the ones from his teenage years when he still called me Ma and signed his notes, "With love, you always." Those were the hardest to read, because they were written before the edits, before the version of me he learned to shrink. But I didn't rip them up. I didn't box them away again. I put them in a small wooden drawer beside my bed, tied together with ribbon from the first birthday party I ever threw for him. Just him and 5 cupcakes and a balloon that wouldn't float. Because no matter what, I still loved that boy. I always would. But loving him didn't mean disappearing for him. The next day, the doorbell rang. It was my neighbor's daughter, 10 years old, missing her front tooth, holding a tray of muffins. Mama said to thank you for the extra tomatoes, she beamed. I smiled wide and invited her in for milk and cookies. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one my son once climbed under during thunderstorms. She looked around and said, "Your house smells like hugs." And I laughed hard, a real deep laugh, because that's what it had always been, a home, not a showroom, not a canvas for someone else's aesthetic, but a warm, cluttered, wild-hearted home. When she left, I stood by the window and watched her skip back across the street. A quiet thought pressed itself gently into the back of my mind. This is what legacy feels like. Not inheritance, not nameplates or guest lists, but echoes, echoes of warmth. And I thought maybe one day my son would hear that echo too. But I wouldn't wait. I had waited long enough. Spring crept in quietly that year. The wind softened, the trees bloomed like they had nothing left to prove, and my garden awakened with a kind of stubborn joy. The tulips my son once planted as a boy somehow impossibly returned. The bulbs had been buried so deep, I thought they'd died long ago, but there they were bursting through the earth like tiny rebellions. One of them had grown crooked, leaning hard to the left, like it couldn't quite stand straight. I loved it the most. The news from the newlyweds came slowly filtered through neighbors and mutual friends. A honeymoon in the Alps, photos of wine glasses and distant mountains. A caption beneath one picture said, "Elevated simplicity." Always that word, simplicity, as if removing roots made something purer. As if their version of love required everything old to be sanded down until nothing meaningful remained. But I no longer flinched at their phrasing. It was a language that wasn't mine. Let them speak it. I'd found my own. I began writing more often. Not for anyone else, just small reflections in that battered notebook with the creased spine. One morning I scribbled, "I am not basic. I am elemental. I am bread and fire and the stitch in the seam that holds generations together. Somewhere in the rhythm of those words, I remembered my mother's hands, how they used to move across cloth, with quiet confidence. She never needed validation for her labor. She just folded the sheets, stirred the broth, knotted the thread, and called it love. Her strength had been passed down in whispers, in flour-dusted aprons and overwashed teacups, and I had carried it whether they saw it or not. The following Sunday I received an envelope, this time handwritten, my son's name in careful script. I hesitated before opening it. The paper felt heavier than it should have. I took it to the porch, let the morning sun touch my face, and finally unfolded it. It was short. Ma, I've been thinking a lot about everything. I didn't see it, and I should have. I made choices that felt right in the moment, but cost more than I realized. I miss you. I hope we can talk. There was no mention of the wedding, no excuses, just a crack, just enough light to feel something shifting. I didn't reply right away. I let the letter rest on the table beside my tea, letting it soak in the sun like something fragile and rare. I read it again before bed, tracing his handwriting like a map I had once memorized, but lost through years of disuse. I thought about the little boy who once brought me dandelions in his fist roots, and dirt still clinging to them, beaming like he'd returned from battle with treasure. And I thought about the man who now lived in a house where dandelions were called weeds and ripped out before they could bloom. I wanted to answer, but not with words. The next morning I baked, not to send, just to feel him again in the rhythm of the kitchen. Banana bread, his favorite. I mashed the overripe fruit with a fork like I used to, humming that old melody he loved when he was 6. I folded the walnuts in by hand and left the oven door slightly ajar to keep the edges soft. When it was done, I sat with a warm slice, closed my eyes, and imagined him walking through the door like he used to backpack, dropped on the floor, nose sniffing the air, voice calling, "Is that for me?" The ache returned then, not sharp, not bitter, just deep, like a well you draw from with quiet resignation. Later that day I began a letter, slow measured strokes, no scolding, no guilt, just the truth in a mother's voice. I wrote, "You are not the boy I raised, but I know he's still there. The boy who loved messy birthday cakes and mismatched socks. The boy who sat on the kitchen floor when life was too heavy. I have never stopped loving that boy. But I cannot sit quietly while the man forgets where he came from. If you're ready to remember not to visit, but to carry, then my door is open. But not for performances, not for apologies rehearsed through gritted teeth, for presence, for the real." I sealed the letter and left it by the door. I didn't mail it, not yet. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can give someone is a boundary, and the grace to cross it, only if they choose to come barefoot, humbled and ready. That night I sat by the garden again. The crooked tulip swayed in the breeze, defiant and radiant. It didn't need to stand straight to be beautiful. It just needed to bloom. And I understood then, maybe for the first time, that my story wasn't ending with their rejection. It was only beginning with my return. The letter sat on my hallway table for nearly a week. Each day I passed by it, I would pause, not to doubt, but to consider. I'd reread it once in the morning light, and once in the hush of evening, and each time I felt the same quiet certainty rise in my chest. Not yet. Timing, I've learned, is its own kind of language. When to speak, when to wait, when to let silence carry more weight than words ever could. In the meantime, the house settled into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. I stopped tidying things, just to make them pleasing to someone else's eye. I left books open on the table, crumbs on the cutting board, music playing from scratch CDs that skipped in all the right places. Life returned with a pulse that wasn't curated, it was mine. One morning, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, I found a small tin full of cassette tapes. My husband's voice, low, thoughtful, with that same amused softness he always wore when talking to the dog or burning Sunday toast, filled the room. He was reading aloud, Winnie the Pooh of all things, for our son, a bedtime story he had once recorded while away on a work trip. And suddenly there I was, standing barefoot in the attic, with dust in my lungs and tears on my cheeks, listening to the echoes of love we used to give so freely, so fully. That night I played the tape again. I sat in the rocker by the window and just let it run. Every now and then my husband would pause in the recording to laugh. Once he said, "He's probably not even listening to this, but I'm reading it anyway." And in the background you could hear a boy's giggle, faint, sleepy, safe. That was the house we built. And this was the house they wanted to erase. The next afternoon, I baked another loaf of banana bread. I wrapped it carefully in parchment, tied it with twine, and placed it in a small wicker basket with a jar of my peach preserves and a single note. "You're always welcome, but I won't shrink to be seen." I walked it down the street to the mailbox, but I didn't mail it. I brought it to his house. I knew the code, of course I did. I'd helped him set it up. I left the basket on the front steps, just outside the oversized modern door, with no handle, only a black panel that opened when you touched it just right. Everything about their home was designed to be touched gently, but not held. I didn't wait. I didn't knock. I left the gift and walked away. There was power in that, too. Not making him come to me, but showing him I wasn't hiding, that I had no malice, only memory, only love that had finally grown enough spine to stand upright again. He didn't call that day, or the next. But on the third morning, I found a note tucked under the ceramic rabbit by my front steps. It wasn't much, just 3 lines scribbled on thick stationery. I remember the tape. I remember the laugh. I want to come home, not just to visit. I sat on the porch step note, in hand, the breeze catching the edge of it like it might fly. And for the first time in weeks, I let myself weep, not from grief, not from rage, but from the strange, dizzying relief of being seen again. Later that day, I brought down the extra plates. I opened the good linen napkins. I pulled the deviled egg tray from the back of the cabinet, and I set the table not for a party, not for a show, but for a homecoming. He arrived near dusk. No fanfare, no honking horn. He walked up the path like a man returning from war, hands empty, eyes full. And when I opened the door, neither of us spoke. He just stepped in, wrapped his arms around me, and held on. I felt him breathe against my shoulder slowly, deeply, as if he'd been underwater for a long, long time. We sat for hours. No discussion of the wedding, no blame, just stories, little ones. I told him about the crooked tulip. He told me he remembered how it felt to fall asleep on my lap while I read aloud. I played him the tape. He closed his eyes and smiled at the sound of his father's voice. We didn't solve everything. We didn't need to. Healing isn't loud. It's not a single moment. It's a series of tiny recognitions. I see you. I remember. I didn't know I had forgotten, but I do now. He left late that night, but not before promising he'd be back the next day. And as the door closed softly behind him, I stood there in the hallway with my hand pressed against the frame, and I whispered more to myself than anyone else. Let this be a beginning. Because I knew now I hadn't canceled a wedding to punish anyone. I had canceled a wedding to preserve the last real piece of myself still alive inside me. And somehow that small act of reclamation had opened a door for both of us. He came back the next morning with coffee in one hand and a bouquet of lilacs in the other, the kind that don't match anything, don't photograph well, and always smell like childhood. He looked unsure of himself and a little tired, like someone who had finally taken off a mask after wearing it too long. I invited him in without a word, and he stepped across the threshold like a man entering a holy place. We didn't talk right away. We just sat two bodies at the same table, where he once learned to count with jelly beans and alphabet noodles. I poured coffee. He added too much cream, just like his father used to. The silence between us wasn't heavy this time. It was gentle, a place to rest, not a wall to scale. "I've been thinking about Dad," he said, eventually his voice low, about how he always knew what mattered. I nodded. He never needed much to be happy, just the people he loved, and a little room to grow tomatoes. He smiled, and I saw the boy again, if only for a flicker. "I used to think he was too quiet," he said, "but now I think he just didn't waste words." "That's how he made space for people," I said. "He listened. He let love speak louder than decoration." My son looked around the kitchen at the cluttered countertops, the uneven plates, the radio playing softly in the corner. "This place always felt alive," he said, "even when it was just you here." "It was never just me," I whispered. "This house remembers everything." He swallowed, eyes misting. I think I got scared somewhere along the way, of mess, of pain, of not being good enough. I reached across the table and took his hand. "Perfection isn't protection," I said. "It's a costume, and you can't hug someone properly when you're wearing armor." He nodded, tears slipping free now. "She didn't want this version of me," he said. "She wanted the one that fit her feed, the curated one, and I let her have him." I could have said so much in that moment about how I saw it happening, how I'd been shrinking for years, how I blamed myself for letting it go on so long. But instead I just said, "You're here now." And that was enough. He told me they were separating, that the silence between them had stretched too wide, and neither of them wanted to bridge it anymore. I thought we were building something, he said, but it turns out we were only staging it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't say "I told you so." I simply listened, because sometimes what a person needs most is to be witnessed without judgment. That afternoon, he helped me trim the lavender out back. We worked side by side, and though our hands were slower than they used to be, they remembered how to move in rhythm. He asked about the lace again, about whether I still had the dress. I told him I did, though a piece was gone now, given as a message he hadn't been ready to read at the time. "I wish I'd understood," he said, brushing a sprig of lavender against his palm, "what it meant to you, what you were offering." "You couldn't have," I said gently, "not when you were busy trying to become someone else." He paused. "And now?" "Now," I said, "you're beginning again." He stayed for dinner. Nothing fancy. Just roast chicken and mashed potatoes the way he used to request every birthday, until he was 16 and decided sushi was more grown-up. He helped wash dishes afterward. We didn't talk much, but the quiet was comfortable now, no longer the absence of connection, but the space where it could grow back. Before he left, he stood by the door with his keys in hand and asked, "Would it be all right if I came by again? Maybe helped around the house. Just kept showing up." I looked at him, truly looked, and saw not just my son but a man returning to the roots he'd buried too deep for too long. "I'd like that," I said, "but only if you come as yourself." He smiled broader than he had in years. I think I'm finally remembering who that is. When the door shut behind him, I stood in the living room a long while, bathed in the glow of a single lamp, listening to the creak of the house settling into a new season. I hadn't expected him to return, not really. But love, when it's honest, always circles back to the places that made it feel whole. And now, for the first time in a long, long while, I was not just someone's mother or memory or ghost of an aesthetic past. I was a woman with a story, a woman whose presence had finally been seen not as a shadow of what once was, but as the light that never left. The visits became a rhythm, quiet at first, a few hours every week, then more. He didn't announce them anymore, and I didn't need him to. I would hear the knock or sometimes just the creak of the front gate, and I'd feel a small bloom of warmth behind my ribs, like spring turning over beneath the soil. He'd show up with groceries, with questions, with stories about things I never thought he'd say out loud. Sometimes he brought nothing at all, just his body, his breath, his willingness to be there. We didn't talk about the wedding again, not directly. The silence around it had become a kind of garden. Some things were better left unsaid, planted beneath layers of time and choice, growing their own quiet answers beneath the surface. I saw it in the way he looked at the photos on the mantel now. Not with avoidance, but with something like reverence. I saw it in the way he sat in his father's chair and didn't fidget anymore. He wasn't trying to fit into someone else's vision. He was letting himself remember the life that shaped him. One day, he arrived with an envelope. Nothing fancy, just a plain white rectangle creased at the corner. "I need your help," he said, placing it on the table. Inside were forms, legal ones, financial ones, his estate planning and early drafts. I realized, he said, I've been thinking so much about how things look that I forgot how things feel. I don't want to leave behind clean lines. I want to leave behind meaning. I didn't say a word. I just squeezed his hand. He didn't need my advice. He needed my presence. And I gave it freely. We worked in the garden that afternoon side by side. He asked about each plant like he was learning the language of my life. I told him stories how I'd nursed the rosemary through a late frost one year, how the snapdragons had sprouted from seeds his father once threw into the wind with a laugh and no expectations. We laughed too, deep, belly-full laughter that cracked something old and tired inside me. He stayed for dinner again, then again the next night. And before long he brought over some clothes, quietly, without explanation, just a bag in the corner, no grand declarations. But I knew. He was returning not just to the house, but to the part of himself that once called this place home. One evening I brought out the dress, the full one, not the scrap, not the memory, the dress. He stood when I entered the room holding it as if by instinct. "You kept it," he said. "I always would have," I replied. "But I thought I might have to keep it for myself alone." He walked to it slowly, his eyes drinking in the stitching, the faded lace, the quiet breath of it, still living in the folds. "I remember this from the photos," he said. "It never looked like this in my mind. It looks strong, like it's still waiting for someone to ask it to dance." I laughed softly. "It's waited long enough." He helped me lay it across the table, smoothing the fabric with the backs of his fingers. "I wish I had understood what I was discarding," he said. "We all throw things away before we know what they're worth," I told him. "It's part of growing. But learning to come back to them, that's where love begins again." He stayed late that night. We listened to old records. We danced slowly in the living room like I used to with his father, barefoot on the wood floor, careful not to knock into the corner table. For a moment I closed my eyes and pretended we were both young again, and time hadn't burned through so much of what we built. But then I opened my eyes, and I didn't wish for younger days. I was grateful for the now, for the return, for the fact that it's never too late to come home if you're willing to do it with bare feet and no performance. A week later, he brought up the will. I want to make things right, he said, if it's not too late. I looked at him then, and I saw the man I hoped he'd become, not perfect, not polished, but open, human, whole. It's not about being right, I said. It's about being real. You found your way back. That's enough. He nodded, eyes wet. Can I put you back in it? I smiled. Only if you put yourself back in mine. And we laughed. We laughed because we both knew what that meant. This was no longer about documents or deposits. It wasn't even about inheritance. It was about memory and love and choosing finally to see each other in full color again. That night after he left, I sat by the window with the dress folded neatly beside me. I didn't cry. I just watched the stars appear one by one, and I whispered to the quiet, "He's remembering." And somewhere inside I felt myself unshrinking. I felt my breath take up space. I felt for the first time in a long, long while like someone's mother again, not by obligation, but by choice. By midsummer, the garden had become unruly in the best possible way. The lavender had spilled past its borders, the tomatoes had overtaken their cages, and the basil was flowering despite my best efforts to keep it trimmed. It reminded me of how I used to feel as a young mother, overwhelmed, chaotic, but deeply alive. Every morning I'd walk out barefoot with my cup of tea and let the warmth soak into my skin. I didn't prune much anymore. I let things grow, let them stretch even if it meant a little mess. My son had begun showing up without ceremony. No more knocking, no more hesitation. Sometimes he'd bring groceries, sometimes just stories from his day. He had taken a few weeks off work, something he never used to do. I used to think if I stopped moving, everything would fall apart, he said one afternoon, while peeling apples at the table. Turns out everything was falling apart because I never stopped moving. We didn't need to talk about her, about how it ended or what led to it. He didn't offer, and I didn't ask. What mattered was who he was now, not who he'd been beneath someone else's spotlight. That day I showed him my notebook, the one with the quotes, and the small pieces of me I'd been collecting. I watched him flip through the pages, slowly stopping now and then to read one aloud. I am not basic. I am elemental. He looked up at me, eyes wide. You wrote that? I nodded. It came to me one morning, after all the noise had quieted. He set the notebook down like it was something sacred. I've been living in the echo of someone else's voice, he said, and now I just want to hear my own again. He'd started writing 2 little notes and reflections, and even a letter he said he'd never send to her. I needed to forgive her, he told me. Not for her sake, but so I could stop shrinking in the mirror. We took a walk that evening, just the 2 of us, down the path behind the neighborhood that led to the old elementary school. He hadn't been back in decades. We stood by the fence and stared at the swings swaying in the breeze, and I told him the story of the time he skinned his knees and swore he'd never ride the slide again until the next day when he marched up there and went down head first. I was scared, he said. And you did it anyway. We walked home in the soft dusk, our shadows stretched long on the pavement, like memories unwilling to fade. Later, he helped me bring the rocker out to the porch. This belonged here, he said. I don't know why we ever thought otherwise. Because you were taught to be afraid of anything that couldn't be edited. He nodded, settling beside me with a quiet sigh. I used to think power was control. Now I think it might be softness. That's where it begins, I said. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the crickets tune up their nightly chorus. Then he turned to me and asked something I hadn't expected. Do you think I could ever make this house mine one day? It took me a moment to find my breath, not because I was surprised, but because I hadn't realized how deeply I wanted him to ask. Not assume, not inherit. Ask. This house doesn't want to be owned, I said. It wants to be cared for." He smiled. "I think I can do that." I reached over, laid my hand on his, and let the moment hold us. The next morning I took out the will, the revised version. I hadn't signed it yet, not because I was waiting for a performance, but because I was waiting for a truth to settle. And now it had. I signed it with a steady hand and left it on my desk under the photo of my wedding day, the one with the crooked veil and the handmade bouquet. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt at peace. My son came by later that afternoon, and I told him if the house ever becomes yours, promise me something. Anything he said. Don't repaint the kitchen. Let the walls remember. He nodded, eyes glassy. And the garden. Let it grow wild. We cooked dinner together that night. We danced barefoot in the kitchen again this time, to no music at all. Just the sound of knives, chopping pots, bubbling, and two voices that no longer needed to shout across silence. When he left, he hugged me tighter than he had in years. "Thank you," he whispered. For what I asked. For waiting. For still being here when I finally came back. I didn't say it then, but I thought it all the way into sleep. I wasn't just here. I was growing. I was becoming. I was learning how to hold space for myself, too. And somewhere between that thought and the morning light, I realized I hadn't canceled a wedding. I had planted a homecoming. There's something strange about the way time stretches in old age. Days pass more slowly, but moments, real moments, burn brighter. They stay. They imprint. The laughter over coffee lingers longer. The softness of a hand on your shoulder feels heavier, somehow sacred. And when my son began returning not just as a guest, but as a part of the home again, those moments piled like golden autumn leaves. Quiet, unassuming, but deeply heartbreakingly beautiful. We started cooking together on Sundays like we used to. He'd chop while I stirred. He no longer asked for recipes with clean lines or modern flair. He asked for meatloaf, for chicken and dumplings, for banana pudding the way his father used to like it, still warm, still messy. And when he brought over groceries, they weren't curated anymore. He didn't pick the prettiest produce. He picked what was in season, what felt like home. One afternoon, I caught him thumbing through an old photo album. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor like he used to, surrounded by memories that once lived on the walls. The same walls he'd once agreed to neutralize. I watched him as he turned the pages slowly, his thumb brushing against the yellowing edges. He paused at one picture, him in a paper crown on his 6th birthday, frosting on his chin, my arms around his shoulders. "I don't remember this day," he whispered. "I do," I said. "You cried when your balloon popped, so I blew one up and tied it to your wrist. You said it felt like flying." He looked up at me, and there it was again, that flicker of ache, not just for the memory, but for what he'd let slip through his fingers trying to build a life that didn't know how to hold him. "I tried to replace all of this with perfection," he said, "but it never filled me." "Because perfection can't hold warmth," I replied. "It's too cold. It has sharp corners. You need things that have been held, worn, touched." We didn't need to speak of the wedding again, but I knew he was still reckoning with it, not out of guilt, but grief. Grief for the silence he'd allowed, grief for the mother he'd almost erased. And I felt my heart soften not out of weakness, but wisdom, because it takes time for people to remember who they are, especially in a world that profits off forgetting. A few weeks later, I got a letter, handwritten, from her. The envelope was thin, the handwriting careful, slanted, impersonal. Inside was one page. "I know I hurt you. I didn't understand the weight of what I dismissed. I see now that you were never in the way. I just never looked closely enough to see the foundation beneath me. I hope you and he can rebuild something. I'm sorry I didn't make room." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the others, not out of forgiveness, not out of spite, but out of truth. It was a mark in the timeline, a small echo of recognition. Sometimes that's all we get, and sometimes that's enough. That weekend, my son and I went to the flea market. I hadn't been in years. He picked out a chipped porcelain mug that reminded him of one I used to drink from when he was little. I found an old radio, dusty and forgotten, but when we plugged it in, it hummed softly to life. We brought it home and set it on the kitchen counter. The sound was a little warped, a little fuzzy, but we danced anyway. And in that imperfect song, I felt something release, like tension I didn't know I was carrying, had finally left my shoulders. He was different now. Not fixed, not finished, but real. And in being real, he became whole. That night, we sat out on the porch with 2 cups of tea and no words. We watched the stars come out one by one, like tiny yeses whispered across the sky. At one point, he turned to me and said, "I think I would have been proud to marry someone like you." The words hit me like a wave, and I didn't respond. I just reached out, took his hand, and squeezed. We sat there a long time, fingers laced, rocking slowly. The wind moved through the trees like a hymn. The garden slept below us, wild and unkept and perfect. And I thought to myself, this is what I wanted. Not to be worshipped, not to be pitied, just to be seen. The house was quieter now, but not empty. It was full of memory of music, of the soft sound of someone coming home not just through the door, but into themselves. I hadn't rewritten the will out of spite. I'd rewritten it out of necessity. To remind myself that love isn't given through fear, it's built through truth. And now at 75, I wasn't someone waiting to be remembered. I was the one who remembered first. Autumn arrived with its usual hush, painting the leaves in gold and rust like a final bow before the silence of winter. My porch filled with that dry, earthy scent. I had always loved the one that smells like endings, yes, but also like preparation. The world shedding what it no longer needed, not in grief but in wisdom. And I too began shedding. Not things, but weight, the kind of weight you don't notice until it's gone. My son still came by. Not every day, but often enough that the rhythm felt permanent. He didn't knock anymore. He just let himself in with the soft clatter of keys and the casual hum of someone who belonged again. He was quieter now, not withdrawn but present in a way that didn't need to fill space with sound. We had entered the season of quieter joys. We finished repairing the old birdhouse together, the one his father built when he was still strong enough to lift a hammer. My son held the tiny nails in place as I steadied the frame. When we hung it back on the tree near the window, we stood side by side and watched a single blue jay hop across the branch and claim it as if it had been waiting. "I like this," he said, "doing things slowly, letting them mean something." "That's what it always was," I said. "You just didn't see it." "I think I was afraid that slow meant falling behind," he murmured. I smiled gently. "But you weren't falling behind. You were just stepping away from yourself, and now you're stepping back in." He looked down at his hands. "I think I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You don't owe me anything," I said. "You just have to carry it forward. Let your children, if you have them, know that a woman once planted a crooked garden and called it beautiful." He laughed softly, wiping a hand across his cheek. "If I ever have a daughter," he said, "I'll name her after you." My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. I'd learned that not all tears are meant to fall. Some just live in the heart, warm and steady like a secret flame. That evening we lit the fireplace for the first time in years. He brought over a stack of logs and I found the old matches tucked behind the spice rack. We didn't talk much, just watched the flames catch, listened to the soft crackling as the logs gave way to light. I handed him a folded napkin, and inside it one final piece of the lace. He opened it slowly, looked at it like something holy. "I thought this was gone," he said. "I kept it," I said, "for the day I knew you'd see it for what it was." He held it in both hands. "I see it now. I see you now." And that was all I had ever wanted. Not praise, not a pedestal, just presence, just recognition, just a space where I didn't have to shrink to make others feel tall. Later that night, after he left, I walked through the house with the lights low and the windows open. The wind carried in the smell of rain, far off, not yet here, but coming. I let it in. I let all of it in. I passed the mirror in the hallway, the same one that once startled me on my birthday. I looked into it and saw not the absence of youth, but the fullness of memory. Lines like rivers, eyes like embers. A face that had given life lost things stood quietly in doorways waiting to be noticed, and now no longer waited. I had rewritten the will, yes. But more than that, I had rewritten the way I saw myself, no longer a footnote, no longer background. I was the ink. I was the page. I was the story. And if anyone ever tried to write me out again, I knew now I would pick up the pen,